I am going to take you to a place that's a little warmer. I'm going to take you today on a journey through this remarkable landscape. But before I do that, I want to back up just a little bit and show you the path that led me to the canyon. I worked for, like Susan said, 20 years for National Geographic and others, mostly doing adventure all over the world, from Mount Everest to Antarctica. And after a while, I became a little fatigued with the magazine world, and I wanted to do a story closer to my heart, closer to my home, do a personal project. So I came back here to a place I grew up. This is a field on my family's cattle ranch in the heart of Colorado. And I was curious about the story of water. We're hearing a lot about water these days, and I was curious about where our water goes, where it comes from, and what is the state of water in the West. It originates up here, the top of the Elk Mountains, 14,000-foot peaks, much like here in Switzerland, higher. But I was curious about the journey of this river that actually goes through 7 states, 2 countries, and supplies drinking water for 40 million people. I was also most interested in things like this Lake Mead behind Hoover Dam you see here, and you see these white lines called the bathtub ring representing the water we used to have. We're in the 2nd decade of drought in the Southwest, and this river and these reservoirs are depleting rapidly. I looked at everything from historical to all the tributaries and wanted to understand how this river system is changing. If you look at the Gila River in 1930 and then you go to it today, you see how we've transformed a once slightly moist environment into a very arid one. And if you follow the Colorado River all the way to the end, 1,500 miles, where it crosses into Mexico and was once the largest desert estuary in North America, you see how we've transformed this into now what is just a vast, cracked wasteland. For 6 million years, the Colorado River flowed to the sea, and not a drop of it has actually reached the ocean in 2 decades. We basically have overallocated this lifeline of the Southwest. At this point, I thought I was done with the Colorado River. I spent 3 years on this project, but I was invited back upstream to this place, to the Grand Canyon. I had looked at the Grand Canyon, but in my mind, I figured this was the protected landscape on the river. This was the pearl on the necklace of the river that didn't need the focus of my lenses. I was brought here to do a talk about the architect of the canyon, the river itself. And when I was here, I started hearing all these stories about the threats that are poised to change this landscape. This landscape that we were told, leave it as it is, by Roosevelt in 1903 when he originally started this in the movement to become a national park. So I got the crazy notion that, well, perhaps I'm not done with this river, and one way to understand this landscape would be to pick up my pack, lace up my boots, and walk the entire length of it. I had some misconceptions when I went into this project. I envisioned this. I envisioned strolling down beautiful beaches along the Colorado River under tangerine light with plenty of time to reflect on the state of the canyon, the river. I teamed up with my friend Kevin Fedarko. To my amazement, it wasn't this at all. This stretch of beach was the only stretch of sand I actually put my feet on. If you understand the Grand Canyon, it is 18 miles wide. It is 6,000 feet deep. The river is 277 miles long, but if you were to hike it and go up and around all the tributaries and drainages, it's more like 750 miles. So I slightly underestimated that. I also underestimated that in order to move laterally through this landscape, you need to move vertically. You need to move up the layers of rock. And when you move up the layers of rock, you, of course, have to come back down to get back to water, typically, or your food. We had friends cache food stores for us. And then when you combine the temperature, which goes up to 108 degrees at night, not long after breakfast, on maybe my 3rd or 4th day, you start to look like this. And if the anguish on my face isn't enough, and my realization that I may have stepped into something much harder than I ever anticipated, then you could see it on the soles of our feet. And if it's not on our feet, then there's a whole other equation of how you find enough food, carry enough calories, because in order to move, you have to stay light. You can't carry too much weight. But this project wasn't about human suffering or physical challenge. That was one component of it. That was just a backbone to talk about this landscape. This area right here is in the heart of the canyon. This is where the Little Colorado meets the main stem of the Colorado. It's considered to be sacred by many of the tribes that live around the Grand Canyon. It is a remarkable place. Of course, many people want to come here and transform the beauty of this into cash. This is just one of the developments, commercial developments, poised to change this landscape. This is a Grand Escalade tram that would bring up to 10,000 people a day to the confluence. To give you a perspective, there are 26,000 people that are permitted to go through the canyon in a year. So in just 3 days, this would eclipse all the people that go through the Grand Canyon. Our project wanted to understand these issues and the people around it, like Renee Yellowhorse is a Navajo woman who grew up above the confluence. She sees the confluence behind her as her Sistine Chapel. This is her sacred landscape. The Navajo, the Hopi, the Havasupai all believe this. And remarkably, she, with her band of 12 Navajo women, of which only four of them speak English, they pushed back and fought heavily against this development, basically $1 billion development, and were able to get a vote against it. It's pushed it back temporarily. The development is playing a long game, so it's not going anywhere. But for now, they have resisted this development. Downstream, you see where 6.5 million people come to visit the Grand Canyon. If you've been there to the South Rim, this is it. And behind it, the park actually does a great job, but behind this area, there is another development with a water ski park, 3 million square feet of commercial space. On some level, there needs to be growth to handle the number of visitation and this growing demand to visit this remarkable, iconic landscape. But the question is, how do you manage that with our resources, with water specifically? The water that they use on the South Rim comes from inside the canyon. It's funneled up, and it comes from these little oases, these remarkable springs that sustain a very rich and vast system of biodiversity. It also sustained us. We would look for these little springs as we moved through the canyon. One of them, in fact, was remarkable to come to after you've been walking for 12 hours trying to find water, and you come to one, you can't drink it. It's advised by the park not to drink it because it's radioactive. It's been contaminated because there is a history of uranium mining around Grand Canyon National Park on the north and south. This is a mine on the north side you can see here. And it's a history of mining that's been around the park. There's now a 20-year ban on any future mining, but there are some active mines still today. And the question is, how does this relate to the water? How does it relate to the watershed that supplies the drinking water for 40 million people in the Colorado River? They did some studies, and they put blue dye in a seep not far from this mine on the north side of the canyon, expecting to see it flow out in the Colorado River below. To their amazement, it appeared here, 26 miles upstream at an elevation difference of 3,000 feet, which reveals just how complex and complicated this maze of water is. The uranium industry says they're doing everything legally and by the book, and this is the richest uranium ore in the United States, and we want clean energy. People have been there for centuries. The Havasupai tribe that actually live in Havasu Canyon inside the park, just outside the park, but inside the canyon. They say they're living on the front lines of a water contamination issue, and so they're very worried. As we move through the seasons, the heat of the fall cooled off as the winter storms arrived, and then suddenly, without much warning, it turned into this frozen layer cake, which moving through it when it's frozen is remarkably nerve-wracking and scary. A misstep, you could slip and go off the edge here. You're 3,000 feet above the river. At the same time, this snow brought a beauty that I didn't expect, this layer cake to change that rocky color of orange and brown into this beautiful mirage of white and red. And then as winter melted away into the spring, we looked out through this porthole into the western Grand Canyon, a place considered to be the godscape, where many say that the puzzles of rock and water get ever more complicated. It became very challenging to find water here as we moved through the landscape. But we wanted to keep moving to see the last final threat that has emerged in the west. This is called Helicopter Alley, and it is where most of the tourists come from Las Vegas. It did not exist 2 decades ago. Now it is one of the busiest helicopter ports in the world. I spent some time down here, and I documented what one day of traffic looked like. I did a photographic merge where I took a picture of every flight that flew through this corridor. And this is what one day of traffic looks like. This is 363 flights sewn together digitally to show what a day of traffic on an idle Tuesday in July looks like in Grand Canyon National Park in the West. And this, of course, is generating a lot of the development interest. There's a lot of money being made here, and people are saying this is an opportunity to take advantage of that. And as you move through the West, up ancient Puebloan routes, this one is 900 years old. We're going up through old artifacts to find the way, seeing markings and old chipped logs to get up this route that few know of. The slot canyons are deeper, and the ramparts are even larger. And from dawn until dusk, as you move through this final vast stretch of Grand Canyon National Park, you can never escape the echo and the drone of turbine engines that you hear consistently throughout the day because of the helicopter traffic down below you and inside the canyon. And then on a Wednesday in November, my friend Kevin and I finally took our last step across the northwest corner of Grand Canyon National Park. A step that represented roughly 750, 800 miles, hard to calculate accurately, 8 trips over 13 months, 8 pairs of shoes, 4 sprained ankles, 2 broken fingers, a case of hypernatremia, thousands of cactus injuries, 2 girlfriends. The list goes on and on. But again, this wasn't about our journey, it was about this place and the remarkable richness that's inside it, the biodiversity, the 700 species, the 91 mammals, the 41 reptiles, the 20 amphibians that live and call this place home. The late author Edward Abbey once wrote that you have to walk, better yet crawl, on hands and knees through the sagebrush and the sandstone and the cactus. And when traces of blood start to mark your trail, then you will see something. Maybe. So what did we see? Ultimately, this was a way to shine a light on our most iconic national park in America. And after doing this and looking back on it, I come away with 3 lessons. The first for me is that when we think of Grand Canyon, we often define it with the visual, with our eye. We think of it in color and texture. But after spending over a year in this place, I come away with what sticks with me the most is defined with the auditory. It is the silence. It is the rich and profound liquid silence that hangs over this landscape. A silence that isn't void of noise, it's just void of mechanical noise. It's hearing the wisp of bat wings in the morning or the distant call of sheep across the canyon. It's so silent at times that the microphones on my camera actually would buzz because they're calibrated to a noisier silence. And you quickly realize how fragile this is by the machines we bring in to visit it. The second lesson happens about this time every day. No matter how hard the journey was, each time, each evening, as we sat above the river, typically, we usually walked away from the river. It's too complicated to walk next to the river. You would hear the distant drone of that American Nile below you, distantly rumbling. But as the night swept in, you would realize that there was another river that crept over you every single night. And that was the second river, the river of stars, that seems to hold you in between its hand and the river below. And if we step up and look at the United States, thanks to the help of NASA, you understand how rich and unique this starlight is, this night sky is, because you see the sweep of starlight moving across the United States. And if you look out on the western side, you see a few dark spots on the map, one of which, right there, is the Grand Canyon, the only canyon you can see from outer space. And when you're in this space, you realize just how remarkable it is. last lesson is that when we look into this remarkable landscape, we often think of it as empty. But in fact, it is richly filled with not just biodiversity, but the tools of the people that came before us, the ancient Puebloans that called this their home. You can find their tools. You can find evidence of where they stored their food in granaries up here on the right. And in secret places, in certain spots in the canyon that we don't reveal because there's too much looting of it, you see their artwork. Paintings that date back some 4,000 years old. And then we often ask, well, where did these people go? But you quickly realize they haven't gone anywhere. They're all around the park. There are 11 Native American tribes that live in and around Grand Canyon National Park. And they are on every side of the issue on a precipice trying to understand how we balance conservation and access, development and preservation. Which leaves us with the question, as this national park is on the verge of turning 100 years old, is how do we see it? Do we see this place as amusement, something we check off the bucket list, or do we see it as sacred and sacrosanct? A living classroom of geology, archaeology, biodiversity, shrouded in silence and soaked in starlight. As we pass it from one generation to the next, we have to keep that in mind because there are already over 400 amusement parks across the United States. And there is only one place that looks like this. Thank you very much.